I'm Jason Grillo with Air Miners. It's great to see you all here today. We are talking today about state and local policy in carbon removal and how that might be a way that you can get involved in carbon removal, how that can affect the industry, and what are some of the kind of differentiating factors that can really make carbon removal shine. It's good to see so many familiar faces here today, as well as some new folks. So looking forward to learning from you and to impart learnings to you as well. To that end, we have an esteemed panel of carbon removal policy advocacy experts and here to speak with you today. We are going to be recording the session and putting it onto our Air Miners YouTube channel for viewing later, for one. Also, as we traditionally do in Air Miners, we're going to have our meeting for 60 minutes, and then at the top of the hour at 10 a.m. Pacific, we're going to stop and go to breakout rooms afterwards so that people can get to know each other, not just know of each other, and to get some of those policy advocacy juices flowing. We've got a bunch of things to share for getting people involved, even if you're not in a state or jurisdiction that traditionally has had a lot to do with carbon removal in the past. What we want to do is kind of push forward the envelope of where we see the forefront of carbon removal policy working. So to that end, once again, thank you all for coming. Looking forward to this, and want to cede the floor to Quincy Childs of the Clean Air Task Force, who's going to moderate today, and take it from there. Quincy, please.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you to the Air Miners community for having us today. I'm excited for this conversation. So I'm Quincy Childs. I joined Clean Air Task Force in April of this year, where I work on policy advocacy for carbon dioxide removal in both Europe and the US. Prior to joining CATF, I was a science and technology policy fellow with the Department of Energy's carbon management team, where I supported strategic engagement mainly for the R&D advancement across CDR methods, both in the US and abroad. And prior to this, I consulted various advocacy groups, policy advocacy groups on equitable carbon management. And I continue to do this in my work at CATF now, where I focus on mainly reimagining two-way public engagement around carbon management projects to ensure the best outcomes for CDR projects and the communities that host them. So definitely relevant to this conversation. And I will pass it on to Chris Neidl.
Great. Excellent to be here. Should I introduce myself? Is that the thing? Great. Excellent. So Chris Neidl, I am the Director of Impact for Rethinking Removals, which is a carbon removal think and do tank that is based in London, but operating in projects all over the world. And I'm one of the two co-founders of the Open Air Collective, which is co-hosting this event, very much overlapped and closely bound up with the Air Miners communities, a lot of common membership. And we work on a lot of things, but we principally drive a lot of CDR advocacy, mostly on the state and local level, particularly in the United States and North America, but also in more national campaigns in Europe and soon Asia. So very happy to be here.
Great. Sue, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Sue Dorward. I am Sustainability and Energy Coordinator at Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey, which is very supportive of my recent policy work on the New Jersey low carbon concrete bill that was supported by the Open Air Collective and Chris. I am also a student finishing up my master's in carbon management at Columbia, hopefully finishing in December. So that's me. And I'm going to post some links about those things.
And Susie?
Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here with the Air Miners community. Thanks for having me. My name is Susie Strife, and I am the Director of Climate Action for Boulder County. I've been in this role for 16 years, and I moonlight as a professor at the University of Colorado. I had the pleasure of creating, with Chris Neidl and another co-founder, a carbon removal coalition for local governments called the Four Corners Carbon Coalition, which basically is seed funding different projects across the Four Corners region in order to accelerate local government action in carbon dioxide removal. So honored to be here. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. I love that. Moonlighting as a professor is very cool. So I guess we'll jump straight in to our first question that we've prepared based on the audience interests that you all submitted when you registered. So the first question is, what are some of the major state and local initiatives that are in play or that you're excited about for CDR today?
I can start that off and then maybe point to a couple people on the panel who are really in the weeds on them. Yeah, I think in North America in particular, there's a few policies that are live right now that are really, really exciting in a few areas, as well as recently passed ones that we think can continue to spread to other jurisdictions. So among the really kind of climate policy heavy hitter states, which you can kind of count on one hand in the US, California, Washington, Massachusetts, and New York, and then a few other states. Colorado certainly could lay claim to that at this point. We have in California what I think is the most ambitious carbon removal support legislation proposed anywhere in the world, and that's SB 308, or the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, and that was introduced last session by State Senator Becker, and that is a really, really exciting. We'll get into the details of that. On the other coast, we have the Massachusetts S2096, which is the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, which actually descends from a very similar bill that was initially introduced in New York State. And that's kind of almost like a stripe for states type of approach that we say. That's where the state is directly procuring carbon dioxide removal each year and escalating that over time in a standards-based, tech-agnostic way that privileges highly co-beneficial sources. And then we have, and I'll pass it over to Sue, some of the more specific kind of narrow focused policies, like the LECLA bills that were introduced and passed in New York, and iterations of that have been introduced in other places as well. And those are focused on the procurement of low carbon concrete, but have an element in them that involves carbon removal and utilization. And Sue is the real veteran of those campaigns. So maybe I'll just toss it over to you, Sue, to speak more to that.
Sure. Yeah, so the low carbon concrete bill, or LECLA, in New Jersey was kind of adopted from New York and modified to to meet the demands of all of the stakeholders. And now there's a group in Pennsylvania that's looking to take the New Jersey bill and adapt it for Pennsylvania. And the nice thing about this bill is ultimately in New Jersey, we got very strong bipartisan support. We didn't get any Republican co-sponsors, but we got the business community and the contractors on board. And that was critical to getting Republican support. So we had almost unanimous support. So moving it to Pennsylvania, which is a purple state, looks very promising, and they can point to the record in New Jersey showing, that Republicans can support this too. And so that's very exciting. And it's, having something that's already been established in one state that you can take as a starting point is a huge, huge help. And especially if you can point to success in other states.
I'll just add to that because that's the perfect layup for the Buy Clean Colorado Act, which is kind of a LECLA light, which what we have here in Colorado, which basically mandates the future public construction projects will meet clear environmental criteria and use common construction materials like asphalt, cement, concrete, and steel. And so what we're trying to do locally is, because this requires basically the Office of the State Architecture and the Department of Transportation to establish policies that include the maximum acceptable global warming potential for these specific categories of construction materials. And what we'd like to do locally is advance that through either kind of a Buy Clean Colorado Plus, which Chris and I have been tossing around a little bit on how do we do that, whether that's an advanced market commitment or procurement or through local sort of indicators or market signals through incentives to add kind of like an accelerant to the Buy Clean Colorado Act. So that's what we've got going on here in terms of CDR removal, or CDR. And there's a lot of room to grow, I think, in Colorado for sure.
if I could just add to that, actually, is that, yeah, Colorado is one of those places. Last legislative session, in a single session, 2 carbon dioxide removal bills were signed into law by the governor. One is basically a really extensive mapping of carbon dioxide removal economic potential and natural resource potential in the state that also expands CDR as an eligible technology form for an existing grant program. And that is a really important sort of baseline for more ambitious policies to happen afterward. And then the other one was a really exciting policy, which is a study bill that Susie's actually involved in the group on with the state, which is the utilization of biochar in orphan and gas well plugging, which is a really exciting application that was developed by an amazing grassroots member of Open Air in Colorado. So those are good indicators, in addition to what Susie will tell you about the amazing work that she's doing, of Colorado is just one of those states that might be a bit off the radar for people on the coast, but they're doing some pretty big, bold things, I think, in regard to climate and now carbon removal.
Thanks so much. I think this is a really important time to shift to the next question, because I'm wondering, what is it about certain states or the state and local level that makes it easier or harder maybe for CDR policy advocacy to advance? What are the right ingredients that a state like Colorado has? Is it something like the regional capacity for storage and sequestration? Is it something like the renewable availability for energy? Or is it other things that make state or local level regions sort of more acute in terms of advancing CDR policy onto the next federal level?
Chris, I think you should
Mike,
start
but-
macro and then I can go
Yeah,
micro.
that's a good idea. Maybe we can kind of take that in general. So a couple of things. I think one is particularly in the US context, as we've known, there's a lot of uncertainty at the federal level, to say the least, around policy continuity over time. We've had a good moment over the last couple of years, but that can get disrupted and repealed quickly, and things can kind of move slowly. And in the states, we've always had a tradition where there are certain states that lead in certain policies. This is this laboratory of democracy thing, which is actually quite real, where they establish certain model policies, which can be impactful in their own right, but they can and do then inform or inspire federal policy as well. A state like California has played an outsized role in that, but others have as well. The 2 other things I'll say quickly on that. One is that in terms of easy or hard. So the easier part about states is they're more, and local governments, is they're more accessible. You can actually engage with members of the legislature or government. They're less armored as, Congress is, or the White House, for instance, or any of the relevant departments. So advocates can actually have a lot more interaction. I see Carl Dans on the screen right there, Open Air member, who is every week, it seems like he's managing to bump into an actual legislator and tell them about carbon removal in California. So that's a huge upside to that. The downside to it, I guess, is that you just don't have the resources or capacity necessarily at the state level to kind of absorb and incorporate some of these new ideas. So there's a lot more kind of I would say, a steeper learning curve more generally in states. So I would say those are relatively balanced. And then the last thing I'll say is that with states and local governments, and I'd love Susie to speak to this, is that we need to be talking about carbon removal within very specific social and resource and economic and historical context, right? We need to be linking CDR, not in the abstract to like, we should do this because the IPCC says it and it's good for the climate in 50 years. We need to be relating it to what is it like in that place. And you can, when you take that lens, you can find things that we call hooks, and you can really relate it really, really strongly. And we have an amazing bill in development right now with a group of advocates in Oregon that is like the perfect example of that. And me and Susie have been talking about that in Colorado. And those local officials can see those opportunities a lot more clearly than their federal, more high altitude counterparts. And I think that that's a real creative driver of policy when you're thinking about it on a highly local level. But again, Susie is sort of the poet laureate of that way of thinking. So I don't know if you want to add anything to it, Susie.
No, I think you're right. Like, I think at the macro level, really carbon dioxide removal from the local context has to make sense in terms of the charismatic co-benefits for the local community. And given that we have limited resources and capacity, we really need to ensure that some of our climate action projects that we support are at the intersection of all of that. So resilience, community benefits, mitigation, carbon removal. And what we've done here, and we've been really lucky. I mean, we have not only one of the first ever of its kind sustainability taxes, which is a sales tax, very micro sales tax that supports a lot of this innovation funding. But what we've done is we've created what's called a climate innovation fund to support both nature-based and tech solutions in CDR. It was one of the first sort of governments to stand up a mini infant kind of X Prize to say, look, we know there's incredible climate pioneers out here, right? We have we have amazing national labs, NREL, NIST, NOAA, NCAR, UCAR, and we have a lot of climate scientists and PhDs here who are doing amazing climate tech. And so what we're saying is like, all right, we're going to put a very small amount, actually, not huge comparatively to what the tax revenue is. We're going to put it towards innovation, and we're going to show and demonstrate that this works for our community and talk a lot about the co-benefit. It's not just reduce it down to the carbon kind of management piece or the carbon accounting. We're going to talk a lot about job creation and equity and the co-benefits of resilience and water retention from a lot of these projects. And also just the build out, right? So like Chris was in town last week and we went and visited some of the winners of some of these awards. And it's incredible to watch that a small amount of funding, like $40,000 to $100,000 from the local government level, can unlock a lot of other potential funding. And then what happens is that there's interest from media and from legislators in those demonstrations. So we bring them out, bring media, bring legislators out. And then that's when the runway to policy is a lot faster. So we're utilizing this as more of a demonstration on the innovation side to showcase what's possible. The biochar advisory bill that we are working on right now is a perfect example. That plugging old oil and gas wells with biochar came through the process through our grant and got a lot of attention. It actually didn't win in our proposals, but it did generate a lot of legislative attention and from our legislators. And now we're in a study bill. So I think that showcases like small seed funding for innovation that matches again, I like to use it as like this charismatic local storytelling or narrative that fits and matches the values of your community really matters in the long play with policy.
If I could even add one thing to what Susie just said that I think is so critical to think about the local. When we think about these big climate problems, particularly when we know we have to do them at a gigaton scale and fast, it biases some people's imagination around very high level decision makers. If we just had some giant regulatory body that said, we're doing this, but in reality, it's almost the inversion of that, I think, in terms of the order of operations. And when you have local governments, when I mentioned those two bills that passed in Colorado, one of the reasons why that was able to happen is because the oxygen in the room was already being filled with carbon dioxide removal discussion because of what Susie was doing in Boulder. So it's one thing to be in a state and be like, oh, no, trust me, the IPCC thinks this. It's a whole other thing to say, Susie Strife is doing this. And Boulder County is already doing this. This is a real thing. And for where we are right now with CDR, where just basic knowledge is such a fundamental thing, if you have local activity, that really, really, really matters and creates a more conducive environment for passing, more higher level policies. And then the other thing is that we talk a lot about learning curves in technology, like the rate at which cost reduction goes down and technologies get better. And there's a relationship between smaller, more modular technologies that have better learning curves compared to really big ones. And I like to use that as a metaphor to think about policy, and that when you have local, by definition, there's way more local governments than there are higher level governments. So that means it's a more targets, more context in which model policies can emerge and can talk to each other and get better at a rapid rate. Local government can do that because of just the magnitude and number of places that can potentially say yes and move forward on a policy. So just want to kind of stress how small can be quite big in that regard.
Yeah, I would like to add on to that just the power of the individual, both as just us as advocates and individual legislators. I mean, the legislators that I've interacted with love sort of grassroots efforts. They love having their constituents being passionate about something, getting educated about it, coming to them, arguing for a project or a piece of legislation. And that has a lot of power, and and as an individual, you can do that with the support of, a business organization or an NGO that you enlist to support. So you're not just there by yourself, a lone voice. But having that local constituent is really critical to getting a foot in the door and getting their attention. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is being able to focus, like at whichever level of government you're looking at. I was looking at the state government, the chair and the co-chair of the Senate Environment Committee were critical. Understanding what their priorities were, how they think was critical. Our chair of the Senate Environment Committee, Senator Smith, you say California's doing something, he's like, oh, okay, yeah, let's try to keep up with California. Or you say New York's doing something, you're like, oh, we should be doing that. And, that's just how he thinks. Like, he doesn't necessarily want to be the first mover, but being the second mover is great. Let California do all the hard work of figuring out the kinks and coming up with a model, and then go from there. And I think that's what I think Chris was saying about, not having the resources necessarily at a local level to dive in, but let someone who does do the diving in and then leverage that in your own community.
And Sue, just to follow up on that, I'm wondering what you think is that this is another sort of irony, I think, that we assume the way environmental politics works, that you only have credibility if you're part of some, big blue chip nonprofit organization. And those play a critical role and they're often our partners. But at that early stage, don't you think that nothing is more convincing than an articulate, knowledgeable grassroots advocate with a Gmail account? There's something charming about that allows you to kind of get in.
My first step in this was all by I had talked to Chris and I knew about the New York bill, but I was at a presentation that a local assemblyman was giving to a sustainable business group in our county. And afterwards I said, hey, I heard about this bill in New York. Would you be interested in learning more about it? And he's like, yeah, send me an email. And he ended up sponsoring the bill in the assembly. He wasn't even in the environment committee, he was in the innovation committee. But he was like, yeah, let's just take the New York bill, we'll send it to legal services to rewrite what needs to be rewritten and go from there. And it just, it started like this little seed, and then it grew as people heard about it, and we were able to pull in, just do outreach, do cold calling to environmental organizations, see if they're interested, and we just kept growing. But yeah, it started with that first, constituent talking to the legislator one-on-one.
It's really encouraging, I think, to hear through all of these examples just how far a small amount of funding or state level support can really go to unlock the catalytic funding and further build those coalitions, and the media interest as well to funnel as this sort of stream of accelerating innovation that can then further perpetuate more policy development and funding. So I'm thinking now about what all of these success stories might indicate for opportunities available to startups at the local level. So in what ways do different state or local policies matter to startups, and how can startups maybe work together to affect the positive policy outcomes that they need?
Yeah, you guys want me to go first on this one, unless somebody has something top of mind? I think it is so important because, again, one of the things that we're up against with carbon removal is that people think it's not a real thing, right? And so when you do your advocacy, you need to, as we call, sort of poster boy the companies that are actually doing the work. And you want to, whether that's having them testify at hearings, that's having them come into little roundtables, closed door sessions you're doing with committee members, having them on your webinars that you launch your campaign with, you want to show those companies. If they're based in the state, even better. If the applications that they have relate to core resources or strengths or aspirational economic sectors of a state, even better, And so that is really, really important. Everybody knows what a solar panel is. You don't need to convince somebody, hey, solar panels are real when you're talking about the solar policy. We do need to do that with carbon dioxide removal. And I think for that, with, as Carl knows and other people that are involved in our California effort, we had a last like 2-week push during the last session, and it was amazing. We had all these local CDR startups joining the call, talking about it, side by side with scientists, and it was really, really compelling. So we just consider startups to be part of the team, like to jump right in. We don't really make that distinction. And big shout out to like Heirloom and Carbon Built, and who am I forgetting, Jason? There's a lot of companies that really get that in our Carbon Cure that are really engaged in the policy effort in a grassroots way.
Well, and also the startups that I've talked to recently talk about funding gaps of, as you're scaling up, you get to a certain scale and there's no federal funding to go for because you're in between. You can't do the large grants, you can't do the small grants anymore. And so they have needs, right? And when the local government is concerned about economic development and jobs and innovation, and want to support that, you've got to communicate what those businesses need. And it, just to have, like Chris was saying, having that poster child and saying, this is how it's going to help. This is how many jobs they think it's going to make, or revenue it's going to be. To have it be not just abstract is critical. But they, these startups have needs, and let the policy support them.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is so great because it's like cascading, right? So it goes from macro to like micro. But my micro example of what Chris just said is we also have to talk about the beneficiaries of the project. So when I went in front of the commissioners and just shared what we did with Carbon Built and their work with Habitat for Humanity, and I shared this narrative of this family that got their starter home, a very subsidized, affordable house that was utilizing DAC plus low embodied concrete to make their first starter home. The commissioners right there and then interrupted me and said, go figure out a project right here locally. So it's like that again, I keep using this word, but it is that the charismatic stories that the beneficiaries, and the actors who are all involved, elevating their stories to all sorts of different, whether that's legislators or the media or the local county commissioners or the city council. Their stories are compelling enough to move somebody to act. That's what I've noticed. And I think it's just different than anything I've ever seen in terms of how grassrootsy this actual movement is. And I've been really lucky because Chris is sort of serious policy expert at this. And so when I add him to the room in terms of helping Colorado move along, that I guess verifies and adds a lot of like just this next level of like expertise that I certainly don't have. So the fact that like Open Air and Air Miners are not only providing sort of the activist component, but also some real policy champions that we can lean on to actually move things forward. It's so exciting. I mean, anything that we've ever done in terms of like climate, really like incredible climate action is in the intersection of the public and private sector. Like it's a deep partnership. And so we need the private sector just as much as the private sector might need some local government policy, procurement, advanced market commitments, whatever we do. It's like we go hand in hand in terms of the success of moving this forward and how fast we can do it.
Thanks
Everything
so much.
everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
That's the mantra, right? Everything everywhere all at once. And I think the all at once part, local government can really be quite fast with that. And, really, again, set the stage, I think, for contemplation at higher levels of government.
Yeah, and again, I think these examples just go to show how vital storytelling is, especially for a nascent industry like CDR. The need for startups themselves to showcase their work and bringing them to the table, how compelling that can be to policymakers so they can illustrate where their technology is and how different policies can address funding gaps. Now I want to shift to maybe individuals on this call who are looking to engage in the state level in policy advocacy for CDR. So what is a good place to start? If individuals on this call, they've never done this work before, what are some pieces of advice you can give?
Well, I can start with my experience. I had a great experience just stepping into the Open Air Collective online Discord. That a lot of really smart people on there who are, doing mostly work in their own personal time, trying to make a difference. And they have, like we just had Carl Dans on here, he had a lot of experience working with Citizens Climate Lobby. That's another great organization to get involved with, and they've broadened their scope in terms of the policies that they're getting behind. We have a local League of Conservation Voters organization, and that each state, I believe, generally has one. That they were a big supporter of our LECLA bill. And they're always looking for people to get involved, and they're very welcoming and help people ramp up, answer questions. Just really great community. It's very supportive, and you can find people there to join you or initiatives to join that you find compelling to get involved. And there's so many ways to get involved. I feel like just jump in and look around and you'll find something.
I think Linda had a question, but I'll add one thing real quick to that, is that a lot of people are probably asking, a key thing when you think about policy development that links to that sort of local hooks thing that I talked about is not to try to shoehorn a policy that's built for a particular place into another place, but rather look at what's available with where you are. So California's California. There's no comparing a couple of other states, Washington, New York, Massachusetts, and Colorado are real climate forward states. And they have background policies that enable other types of policies, right? Which we can get into at some point. But that doesn't mean those of you who are in Tennessee or Oklahoma don't think that you have to sit this one out. In fact, in some ways, there's enormously high value for progress being made on a policy front in purple and red states. Do not assume that you have to go to the hyper blue places to do it. And the backdoor for that, to relate it to a comment that Lori, hey Lori, how you doing, made in the chat, is about appealing to Republicans. And sometimes what we think of as co-benefits is writing sidecar to carbon removal. If you're in a red state, you can flip that. And so we have an interesting bill concept in Florida. Florida faces a lot of environmental issues that do link up with CDR solutions that can help mitigate them, particularly with ocean CDR, with things like sand replacement, algae blooms, bleaching of coral reefs. There's CDR solutions that actually can be used to mitigate. So when we talk to an all Republican supermajority in Florida, our way in is not to talk about the IPCC and climate change. It's talk about, let's address these problems that everybody, Senator or Governor DeSantis signs these bills about mitigating these problems, and say these solutions can help solve those. And there's a co-benefit of carbon removal, which it can actually generate carbon credits, which can help defray the mitigation costs of those technologies. It's a total reversal of the way you're going to do it. So when you start looking at those local factors, you can think very creatively about how you can make a compelling case for CDR in the places where you are. And those are really, really high value for us to be able to get those kinds of victories, I think.
Well, I'll jump in. This is Linda Hoflander with CARBA. So thank you. This is a great call. I was really looking forward to this one. I think the hardest part for CARBA as a startup is we started doing our own calling, reaching out here in the Midwest. We're Minnesota based, and realized very quickly that we were a pretty small force, that we needed to reach out and go with other people. So thank you, Open Air and Air Miner. We reached out to Carbon 180. We reached out to a number of associations. The challenge that I found as a startup, and maybe others on the call have had this also, is a number of the associations, there's not a sliding scale for startups. So they're charging the same amount for membership to help do lobbying and whatnot, which for many of you, if you know who I'm talking about, it's $25,000 a year. So for a startup that may be, early on in seed or, pre-funding even, it's going to be really hard for them to get on board, but they might have a really good voice and want to be involved. I think programs really need to have more sliding scale tiers for people to engage as they grow. And that's just something I haven't seen yet. So if I'm missing that, anyone who wants to share information on that with me would be great.
I would say one thing on that is those groups are incredibly important and are really, really important partners, but for hopefully ways that we've kind of demonstrated already. And I think Sue is kind of exhibit A of that. I always embarrass Sue on these calls because she was the one, through her effectiveness as an advocate in New Jersey, introducing a new policy idea that nobody had any clue about. And within a relatively short time that overlapped with COVID, it became law from the first time she just mentioned it to, and so I think that you don't necessarily need those organizations to initiate. There's many ways. We have amazing companies that sort of individually are participating in advocacy. If they can link up with the grassroots and everybody can pass a hat and maybe pay for a lobbyist to help you on the inside, which is a nice thing to have, you can get a lot done. And then that helps those other organizations as well to kind of direct their attention to things. And a lot of those organizations are focused on federal policy for very good reasons. And that's sort of an opening that Open Air decided to try to fill with air miners and other groups is states are important, local government's important. Let's focus on that. So you don't need to wait for those groups in order to be effective on the policy front, I would say.
And this might be useful or might not. So take it or leave it, Linda. Thank you so much for your question. One of the things that we realized early on with local governments is that, again, a lot of limited resource. Although I will say a lot of urban centers now have passed their own sustainability tax, climate action taxes, or energy taxes. So there is income and revenue coming in. We actually just did one for cannabis too. So there's a lot of potential there for, allocating for policy advocacy. But what we've done extremely well is in 2016, we realized how important policy was for mitigating the climate crisis. And so what we did was we banded together all local governments in Colorado who have aggressive climate action plans, and we all fund, pooling our purchasing power together, 2 lobbyists at the state capitol to advocate on our behalf as 42 local governments. So in other words, we pay a membership fee proportionate to population to support serious policy advocacy. Now, there are 3,000 local governments in the US that have climate action plans. And so is there a way to encourage, again, that pooled purchasing mentality so that even in the private sector with your local CDR tech startups, or like on the local government level, to be able to really band together and punch above your weight when it comes to state policy? And we've seen 54 bills in the last 3 years pass in legislation because of this very strong advocacy group that we're banding together on. So that's one little micro example of what's possible when you band together, similar to Open Air and to air miners.
Thank you so much, Susie. I mean, that's incredible to hear, not only there being 3,000 local governments, but also the amount that you're able to do by pulling together through that purchasing mentality. That is really great to hear, and I didn't actually know that. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that that's how we started the Four Corners Carbon Coalition. So the idea is that one local government can go it alone, like we are with our little climate innovation fund, but we will have a much bigger impact if we go at it together. And we have, again, the media across 4 states in terms of Four Corners Carbon Coalition. We have, a lot of impact on local government procurement and policies, and sort of the movement itself regionally versus parochially. So as local government actors, we really are having a hard time, managing and mitigating this crisis at that scale. We have to think differently about our resources, our time, our energy, our investment, and look at the macro. And that's what we're doing with both Four Corners Carbon Coalition and what I talked about, the Policy Advocacy Organization. And I'll put those both in the chat, links to those.
Thank you again. I think that actually ties quite nicely to this final question that we have before we shift to Q&As. And it's one that I singled out from the registration responses, which is, how can we overcome NIMBYism? So for those of you that don't know, it's this notion of nominally supporting the idea or acknowledging the need for carbon dioxide removal, but not wanting those projects in one's backyard. The reason I thought this might be interesting for us all to dwell on here and thinking about state and local policy is this is it's an issue that's pertinent across scales, of course, both locally and at the state level, but also with regards to federally funded projects where there may not be an interest across all US taxpayers to develop first of a kind projects in the US, and how that NIMBYism, so to speak, could have implications for international deployment of these same technologies. So that is to say, I guess the question could become, do you think it's incumbent upon countries like the US to advance or lead on the development of standards, say for community engagement, before CDR is deployed elsewhere in the world, where there may be less stringency for certain community safeguards in a project? And what might the role be for states in stepping forward to receive these projects, in terms of applying for funding and permitting to de-risk the technology so it can be deployed in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, and Susie would, the whole theory of the case for us with Four Corners and with what Boulder's doing is that by having it be locally rooted is one way of nullifying the NIMBYism, because you're creating a process by which you're having a conversation about it in a very local context, and it's being driven by very trusted, credible people at the local level. But one other thing I would say even more fundamentally is to back up and not assume that there is NIMBYism. I think that that's one of the things that has happened with, there'll be certain, but who are the people that are raising alarms about it? And are they representative at the community at large? So we all know, we could speak openly about this, that within the broader environmental community, climate community, there are voices that are very skeptical or antagonistic to carbon dioxide removal. And they're often, in shorthand, associated with being somehow representative of particular communities. But the reality is, if you go knock on the doors of those communities where those organizations, represent, what do those people think? And in the limited amount of polling that we've done on the state level in New York about carbon removal, we had enormous bipartisan support for the idea of the state investing, 65% Republicans, and that didn't match up with some of the narratives and concerns that are being raised by environmental organizations. And I do think that you trigger some people when it does seem like here's from the federal government and it's going to land somewhere and it's irrespective of place. But if instead it arises from the ground, you enter a different perceptual portal, I think. And I think that we're seeing results for that right now, Susie, in Colorado for sure, right?
Yeah, and we're not using carbon dioxide removal as our centerpiece. I'm just being clear. And I think it does work. It seems like, Sue, you've had success with that. We're using different words that matter and that match the values of our community. We're looking at restoration, wildfire mitigation, co-benefits, like I keep saying, job creation, climate innovation. Those we're not, and yes, an outcome is CDR, right? But the entry, the welcome mat is something else. And that's where the story, I think, is elevated from the local community context, as well as the criteria by which we evaluate proposals. So we have carbon dioxide removal, scalability, durability, all of these different tech ways of looking at it, or accounting ways of looking at it rather. And then we have the softer components that actually are scored higher. So is this regional? Who are the beneficiaries? Does this have an equity component? What's the workforce component of this? And so, or where is this cited? Can this improve restoration and resilience? So these are the criteria that kind of the knob turns higher on, or we get to score a little bit more, give more points for that local piece. And I think that helps tremendously. It's not just, okay, we're going to do a huge DAC facility right here in Boulder, right? It's more on this micro scale and starting there and then building up sort of the lexicon and the knowledge that, okay, this actually has a ton of co-benefits. So I'll give another example. So Charm Industrial is coming tomorrow to Fort Lupton. And that I won't give Boulder County all the credit for that, but they also were applying for our Climate Innovation Fund, and they were involved in Four Corners. And I think what they saw are market signals that Colorado is friendly. And we're also putting out a liability biomass RFP where they're saying, ooh, we can, we're going to be a huge player in helping Colorado mitigate huge catastrophic wildfires, right? And So I think there's just these signals that we can send that are part of the narrative. But again, the centerpiece of it is not necessarily carbon dioxide removal.
And the federal mandate for community engagement in their recent grants has been critical in that it recognizes what I think the startups have seen all along, is that if you don't do early community engagement to prevent the NIMBYism, it can come back to bite you even when you think things are okay. It's just that people haven't gotten engaged yet. And when they get engaged, you want to make sure that they are up to speed on the benefits. So you really have to take the community engagement seriously, because it can kill your project if you don't.
Yeah, definitely. Engaging early and often, and again, all the different considerations that make up that micro scale criteria when ascertaining local views or needs for a project to address, and that signaling that's so important. And Chris, thank you. I really appreciate that point about polling, because I think each time we see the results, it's always strikingly bipartisan for now, which I think is very unique in the climate policy discourse and is a huge asset for us to consider in thinking about this work. So I guess that's all for the questions we had prepared. I guess, should we open it up to the Q&A?
Yeah. Grant Faber had a question kind of about community engagement. So I might have addressed a little bit of it, but Grant, feel free to unmute and ask.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all very much for the panel. Very interesting stuff. So yeah, like Jason said, I think we touched on this a little bit, but I was curious if you could all speak a little bit more about the interplay between state and local action and policy on CDR and the community engagement piece for CDR startups or larger corporates that are doing it. And specifically, I wrote here, like, I'm curious how we can leverage early wins to build stronger social license to operate when outsider CDR companies or initiatives come into a community and are trying to sell their product, as well as more generally too. And then also if there are ways that we can be like strategic about this. So thanks.
I have one thought on that, but I loved it. Susie's really immersed in it, but I would say three things: field trips, site visits, open houses if you don't have a project, and happy hours that are really good ways of getting people to come in, talk, and meet. We just had an amazing happy hour in Boulder, the first one. Letting people know that there are other people around there and to bring their friends who might not be as knowledgeable about it. And those might be legislators or people in, in the public sector. Those kinds of like casual types of gatherings, but field trips, to the extent that you have projects that are actually happening in CDR, live ones in your state, bringing people to see those and to talk through that is like seeing is believing. Like, you convince people with shovels, not sentences. I mean, that is really, really, really important. So those are just a couple thoughts.
I couldn't agree more. We just had a wonderful, and it was almost an afterthought, Grant. We thought, oh, maybe people will be interested in this demonstration project. And so we just sent the invitation out. Oh my gosh, everyone from our whole, like our decision makers to just interested community members, and then NPR, CPR, all these media outlets were fascinated. And this project particularly wasn't really even a CDR specific project. It was a mycelium inoculation on woody biomass. And so, yes, there's different ways to look at it, but it's not going to accelerate CDR. It's only going to accelerate the release of carbon. Nonetheless, in terms of catastrophic wildfire and getting rid of that liability biomass or the forest waste, people just love that. And a lot of examples in this CDR sort of cement concrete area too, like Chris said last week, just tons of interest. And I think that for me, that was a kind of a surprise, like, oh, I should be putting this out there more. Like I tend to not think that these events will actually drum up interest, and they do. So it's always surprising.
Yeah, that builds on a point that we always talk to our launchpad companies about when they're developing their pitch decks. Just take a picture, put it in the pitch deck, show a photo of someone with a with a lab coat or with a welding torch and face shield, something like that to show that this is real, this is a thing. that this is something that is happening here and now, and that it's something that people can engage with and have that human element to it, beyond just talking about something in a like 35 page report. Okay. Other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. I've actually got one. Can you talk about examples of engaging with not necessarily other CDR companies, but non sort of CDR adjacent organizations to get things done in your local area? Thinking in Washington in particular, Washington State, where I live in particular, there are numerous other civil society organizations that are interested in climate, interested in energy, interested in this, interested in that. How, what do you thought? How has that been? What are some best practices for engaging with those types of organizations who are kind of lateral to CDR and getting them involved effectively?
It's a challenge, I think, definitely. Particularly, there is a kind of a bargain that is implicit in a lot of environmental politics, that politicians have to deal with many different issues. They sort of shorthand the idea of who they think is a credible expert on it. And a lot of those are environmental organizations. And environmental organizations, in many cases, not all of them, there's many awesome ones, CATF, and there's a whole bunch of them that are phenomenal, that are totally on board, RMIs, a bunch of, but that, the key is with networks like ours, with Open Air and Air Miners, and also for, the coalition that Susie mentioned, one way to do that is to, rather than be another organization next to those organizations, is try to get inside of those organizations. If you're an open member-based organization, have some members who join you that are part of that organization. And then they can talk about it internally in that casual zone where, again, as I was talking with Susie, it's about 90% of things happen just through relationships. So, don't look at them as a building, look at them as an assembly of people who happen to work in a building, and then try to meet those people, talk, and then the ideas can get socialized in that type of way. But I do think it's important to particularly reach out to groups in the states where you have those groups are particularly relevant or powerful, that it might be quite remote from environmentalism or climate. They might be certain industries that are important that also could be linked up with forms of carbon removal. So you want to think very opportunistically and very locally about who it is that you should talk to. Sue has a good example of that, with the road builders and stuff like you could say it, Sue, like some of the groups.
Yeah, no, the contractors were critical. And I had no idea. I mean, the concrete manufacturers were on board. The Chamber of Commerce was on board. The contractors were afraid of change. And so we totally reshuffled the bill to be a tax incentive rather than a bidding preference, because that was what they were comfortable with. And our sponsor in the Senate, the co-chair of the Environmental Committee, would not move forward if the contractors opposed. And so it was, we needed to get them on board, and we had no idea up front, and this was kind of like late in the process, we find out we need to accommodate them. And then also, and I think someone touched on this before, not all adjacent organizations are friendly towards CDR, and don't go in assuming that just because they're, well-regarded environmental organizations that they're going to support you, and actually trying to get them on board as supporters early on may actually backfire, because they may be big opposition early on. Really, if they can just stay out of it, like if you can detect where they stand, and if you can't infiltrate to the point of changing their minds, it's better to keep them at a distance until you're more established. And it's a little counterintuitive. But yeah, some of the biggest opposition that we had early on was from environmental organizations that wanted everything built with wood instead of concrete. Just things that weren't necessarily practical, but some people are saying, that was like perfect is the enemy of the good. You're trying to improve things in a realistic way, as opposed to saying it's got to be, 100% no fossil fuels now.
I have a question here. Could any of you Sorry, is it okay for me to ask a question, Jason? All right. So could the panelists talk about what's happening on carbon pricing itself? Right now, everything is predicated on voluntary markets, and those things are not very sticky, whereas actual pricing and carbon tax, or which takes into account externalities, is likely to be sticky and will drive more behavior change. So could the panelists talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the bills that I referenced, not LECLA, which was different. Although, there's kind of three different ways you could think about that, like procurement. So that's where you have states say, we're going to buy a certain amount of carbon removal. You have compliance policies, like the California one, which would force high emitting facilities to start buying carbon removal side by side with cap and trade. And then what was the third one? Did I say two or three? I can't remember. It's too early. I can't remember the other one I was going to say, but they all do relate directly or indirectly to carbon pricing. And that is so key because a lot of people, the reference point is dirt cheap offsets when they're thinking about this. We got to kind of free people's minds for that. So when in both of those policies, by requiring facilities to buy carbon removals and not get off the hook with a cheap offset, that's sort of creating a kind of a pricing ceiling. And if you have a California or floor, I should say, that is acting it, that's the fifth largest economy in the world, and that starts to really sort of drive behavior. In Massachusetts, we have a maximum price for carbon removal, but for procurement, and it's several $100s. So it allows for us to kind of jump beyond that, what people normally think about the carbon pricing within the framework of offsets. So states, public sector has to start doing that. They have to start creating this separate channel for carbon removal that's rooted in the science, that we have to do carbon removal in addition to mitigation and adaptation. And they have to start setting realistic price structures or requirements that reflect the actual cost of carbon removal projects right now. So that is either explicit or implicit in most of the bills that we work on. It has some effect on what the assumptions or the tolerance can be for buying carbon removals.
And I'll just say from the local context, one of the ways we got into carbon dioxide removal from Boulder County's perspective is I put out an RFP because I was curious about offsetting our entire cannabis industry. It's 6,000 metric tons a year. And I was requesting for high quality carbon dioxide removal projects to be able to offset, purchase high quality offsets. And of course, I got back pretty much nothing from that request for proposals. So I thought to myself, well, why would I be funding projects that don't exist yet? This was in 2021, right, Chris? Why would I be spending taxpayer dollars or even revenue from the cannabis industry to support this? Why not start showing market signals here to initiate climate innovation and localized CDR projects? So now it's kind of like carbon insetting in some ways, you could say. But what we're trying to do is build up and send market signals here before, right, a potential carbon pricing comes down the line. We would have to have a different set of circumstances at the state to be able to do that. But we've thought long and hard about when pricing signals are valuing carbon at the point at which it should be valued, we're going to be ready because we built up an entire community of climate pioneers doing this work. So they're going to be ready for carbon markets, which is exciting.
All right. Thanks all. And thank you to our audience. We're at time. We're officially at 10 a.m. Pacific. So this is the conclusion of our main part of the event. We're going to hang on for another maybe 20, 30 minutes now to have some networking and continue the conversation so people can get to know each other and start some of those ideas on advocacy in CDR. So thanks once again. Our next, I shared the panelist emails. If you have follow-up questions to anyone on the panel about things that might not have been addressed in our discussion today, in a couple of days, the recording of this is going to be on our Air Miners YouTube channel for people to share. Also, please answer our post-event survey. We want to always improve our quality of our content in Air Miners. The best way we can do that is by hearing from people like you in our audience about what is going well, what's not going so well, and what are paths forward that we can do. So with that, I just want to say once again, thanks. And our next event is going to be in a few weeks, talking about startup storage companies and pairing them with early stage startup direct air capture companies. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And until then, I just want to say thanks and looking forward to seeing you soon.